Some people think the loudest voice owns the land. They never expect the quiet man holding the oldest key. The first thing I heard that morning wasn't the call of loons drifting across Blackwater Lake. It was the harsh rattle of a heavy chain sliding across my dock, followed by the metallic snap of a brand-new padlock clicking shut. The sound cut through the stillness like it didn't belong there. I stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee warming my hands, breathing in the familiar scent of pine, damp cedar, and cool lake air that had greeted my family every summer for nearly 50 years. Then I saw them. 4 black SUVs lined my gravel driveway, their polished paint reflecting the rising sun. Men wearing private security jackets stood beside them, while a woman in a perfectly pressed white blazer walked toward my cabin, carrying a thick folder under one arm. She smiled before she even reached the steps, but it wasn't the kind of smile that welcomed neighbors. It was the smile of someone convinced the ending had already been written. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks," she said, holding out a document with polished confidence. "I'm Linda Crawford, president of the Blackwater Shores Homeowners Association. You're required to vacate this property within 30 minutes. For a second, I honestly thought she had the wrong cabin. I looked past her toward the weathered wooden sign my grandfather carved by hand back in 1976. The faded letters still read Brooks Landing. The old brass wind chime hanging beside the porch stirred gently in the breeze, producing the same soft notes I remembered hearing as a boy while my grandfather cleaned fish at the end of the dock. Nothing about this place had changed except the strangers standing on my property acting like they owned it. I unfolded the notice. Across the top, bold letters declared immediate community repossession order. According to the paperwork, my cabin had supposedly become abandoned recreational property and was now scheduled to be converted into a community lakeside clubhouse. My name appeared only once, listed as the former occupant. Former occupant. I almost laughed. My truck was parked beside the woodshed. Fresh. Lumber sat stacked next to the porch where I'd been replacing damaged deck boards all week. Smoke still drifted from the stone fire pit behind the cabin where I'd watched the sunset the evening before. Nothing here had been abandoned except common sense. Linda watched my expression without blinking. "If you cooperate," she continued smoothly, "this will stay simple. Otherwise, law enforcement has already been notified to assist with your removal." One of the security guards began wrapping bright orange tape across the entrance to my dock, as though he were closing a construction site. Another photographed the cabin from several angles. Every click of the camera sounded louder than the last. The air suddenly felt colder despite the morning sun climbing over the trees. Across the lake, a fishing boat slowed almost to a stop. I could feel curious eyes watching from the water, waiting to see how the man in the old cabin would react. I folded the notice carefully instead of crumpling it. My grandfather always said paper could outlive anger, so I slipped it into my jacket pocket without saying a word. Linda mistook my silence for surrender. She turned toward the security team and nodded confidently. "Go ahead," she said. "We're finished here." She had no idea that before the sun disappeared behind those same pine trees, someone with far more authority than the HOA would step onto this gravel driveway, read the very same document, and change every single person in front of me from confident spectators into nervous witnesses. My name is Ethan Brooks, and if you had driven past my cabin a week before that morning, you would have seen exactly what my grandfather always wanted people to see. A weathered cedar cabin that belonged to the land instead of trying to conquer it. The porch sagged just enough to remind you it had survived countless winters. The dock stretched almost 60 feet into Blackwater Lake, its boards polished smooth by decades of fishing boots, wet dogs, and bare feet chasing fireflies after sunset. Every nail, every beam, every window frame carried a memory instead of a price tag. My grandfather, Walter Brooks, built this place with his own hands in the summer of 1976 after returning from 30 years as a state park ranger. He used cedar cut less than 10 miles away, hauled every beam himself, and refused to rush a single corner because, as he liked to say, a cabin should still be standing after the people who built it are only stories. When I was 8 years old, I spent nearly every summer here learning things no classroom ever taught me. He showed me how to read weather by watching the surface of the lake instead of the sky. He taught me that the smell of pine became sweeter just before rain, and that the quietest mornings usually produced the biggest bass. Every sunrise began with the whistle of the old kettle, the aroma of black coffee drifting through the kitchen, and the gentle music of that brass wind chime hanging beside the porch. Even now, every time it moved with the breeze, I could almost hear his voice telling me not to waste energy arguing with people who had already decided they were right. After college, life pulled me away. I became a civil engineer specializing in water infrastructure, spending nearly 2 decades designing reservoirs, flood control systems, and shoreline restoration projects across the Midwest. My work kept me on the road more often than at home, but every few months I came back to the cabin. Sometimes for a weekend, sometimes for only one quiet evening. I always left feeling steadier than when I arrived. When my grandfather passed away, he left me only one handwritten letter. It was folded inside the original brass key that opened the front door. The paper had yellowed with age, but one sentence stayed with me every single day. He wrote, "Never let anyone convince you that memories have less value because they cannot be measured." I carried that letter in the glove compartment of my truck ever since. 6 months before Linda Crawford appeared on my porch, I finally accepted that I was ready for a different life. I resigned from my engineering firm, packed everything I owned into a trailer, and returned to Blackwater Lake for good. I spent my mornings replacing old deck boards, sanding windows, repairing the stone chimney, and restoring the dock one weathered plank at a time. Neighbors waved from fishing boats. Local store owners remembered my grandfather's name before they remembered mine. It felt like coming home instead of starting over. That was why the document sitting inside my jacket pocket felt so impossible. It was not simply telling me to leave a piece of property. It was asking me to walk away from the only place that had ever taught me who I was. While the brass wind chime continued singing above the porch as if it already knew this cabin had survived far greater storms than a woman carrying an expensive folder. If there was one thing Linda Crawford understood better than lakefront sunsets, it was leverage. She had spent almost 20 years selling expensive waterfront homes to people who wanted postcard views more than peaceful lives. And somewhere along the way, she started believing she owned more than the listings. She carried herself with the polished confidence of someone who had never heard the word no without immediately searching for a way around it. Every Saturday morning, she drove through Blackwater shores in the same pearl white luxury sport utility vehicle, slowing just enough to inspect lawns, mailboxes, boat lifts, and flower beds with the careful attention of a museum curator. Neighbors smiled when she waved, but the smiles always seemed to disappear the moment her vehicle rounded the next bend. I noticed the pattern during my first month back at the cabin. Conversations stopped whenever her name came up. People changed the subject. Some quietly apologized before walking away, as though even discussing the homeowners association could somehow become another violation notice. Then I learned why. Linda had transformed routine neighborhood rules into something far larger than anyone had imagined. A faded mailbox became an official warning. An unapproved dock chair became a compliance review. A family who painted their boathouse the wrong shade of blue suddenly found themselves attending board meetings every month until they finally repainted it. None of those issues seemed important by themselves, but together they created something much more powerful than regulations. They created hesitation. People stopped asking questions because it was easier than becoming the next example. My cabin, however, represented a problem Linda could not solve with warning letters alone. Every premium development brochure featured the western shoreline where Brooks Landing sat. The water stayed calm there even during heavy summer boat traffic. Sunsets reflected across the lake like polished copper, and mature pine trees provided natural privacy that no newly planted landscaping could ever match. I overheard enough conversations at the local marina to understand the vision taking shape. A private clubhouse, expanded guest docks, outdoor weddings, luxury vacation rentals. Every proposal centered around one inconvenient fact. My grandfather's cabin occupied the exact piece of shoreline they needed to connect everything together. One afternoon, about 3 weeks before the eviction notice appeared, Linda stopped beside the dock while I was replacing weathered cedar planks. The scent of fresh sawdust mixed with the cool breeze drifting across the lake. She complimented the craftsmanship before casually mentioning that several investors had expressed interest in improving the shoreline for the benefit of the entire community. Her voice sounded pleasant enough, but every sentence carried the weight of a decision she believed had already been made. She suggested I consider selling while the market remained strong. I thanked her, smiled politely, and told her my grandfather did not build this cabin to become somebody else's marketing brochure. Her expression barely changed, but the warmth disappeared from her eyes. She looked toward the brass wind chime hanging beside the porch, then across the dock stretching into the quiet water, as though mentally rearranging everything that already belonged to someone else. Before leaving, she said something that seemed harmless at the time. Communities evolve, Ethan. The people who refuse to evolve with them usually discover that change does not wait for permission. As her vehicle disappeared down the gravel road, the wind chime rang softly behind me. I remember brushing cedar dust from my hands and thinking she had underestimated something important. She saw a lakeside parcel with impressive market value. I saw the only place my family had never measured in dollars, and that difference was about to become the center of everything that followed. The first official notice arrived 2 days after Linda drove away from my dock. It was tucked neatly inside a weatherproof plastic sleeve hanging from my front door, as if courtesy somehow made intimidation more respectable. The paper smelled faintly of fresh printer ink, and the bold lettering announced that my dock violated newly adopted community shoreline standards. According to the notice, I had 14 days to remove several sections of decking because they extended beyond an updated recreational boundary. I read every line twice while the gentle waves lapped against those same boards my grandfather had built almost 5 decades earlier. The strange part was simple. Blackwater Shores had never maintained my dock, inspected my dock, or paid a single dollar toward my dock. Yet suddenly they claimed authority over every inch of it. I placed the notice inside the kitchen drawer beside my grandfather's old survey maps instead of throwing it away. Something about it felt less like a warning and more like the opening move in a much larger game. The following week, another letter appeared. This time the complaint focused on my boathouse roof, claiming the cedar shingles did not match approved architectural guidelines. 3 days later came another citation accusing me of storing unauthorized building materials because I had stacked replacement deck boards beside the woodshed. Every envelope arrived by certified mail. Every letter quoted a different section of the community bylaws. Every signature belonged to someone on the homeowners association board. I kept every page in chronological order, sliding them carefully into a growing file folder on my dining room table. My engineering career had taught me one valuable habit. Patterns mattered more than individual events. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Then the physical changes began. One morning I drove into town for hardware supplies and returned to find a freshly installed gate blocking the gravel access road leading toward my cabin. A temporary sign read Community Improvement Project. The chain was unlocked, but someone wanted every visitor to believe permission was now required to enter property that had welcomed my family for generations. A few days later, bright orange survey flags appeared along the shoreline near my dock. Nobody had spoken to me beforehand. Nobody explained why they were there. The little flags fluttered in the breeze beside cattails that had been growing naturally since long before the neighborhood existed. Soon afterward, private security vehicles started making slow passes along the road every afternoon. The guards never threatened me. They simply watched. Their tires crunched across the gravel with mechanical precision before disappearing around the bend. Even the quiet of the lake began to feel different. Neighbors who once waved from passing fishing boats now offered hesitant smiles before steering farther offshore. At the general store, conversation stopped when I walked toward the coffee counter. Nobody treated me unkindly. They simply looked uncomfortable, caught somewhere between friendship and fear of becoming the next target themselves. Then came the letter that changed everything. According to the Homeowners Association, repeated noncompliance had created sufficient evidence that Brooks Landing was no longer being maintained as a private residence, but had effectively become abandoned recreational property subject to community action. I read that sentence 3 times while standing beneath the brass wind chime. The soft notes drifted across the porch exactly as they always had, almost mocking the absurdity printed on that expensive paper. My truck sat in the driveway. Fresh paint dried on the porch railing. New cedar boards waited beside the dock for the next day's repairs. The cabin had never been more alive. Yet someone had already decided that reality mattered less than the paperwork they intended to place in front of it. The morning after that last notice arrived, I drove 23 miles into Ashford County carrying a thick accordion folder packed with every letter, photograph, receipt, and survey I had collected since returning to the cabin. The courthouse smelled like polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where time seemed to move more slowly than anywhere else. I waited nearly an hour before a clerk finally called my name. She listened politely while I explained that my cabin had never been abandoned, that I had been restoring it for months, and that the Homeowners Association was now claiming authority over land my family had owned for decades. She typed quietly, frowned at her screen, and then excused herself to speak with someone in the records office. When she returned, her expression had changed. She could not locate several shoreline documents connected to Brooks Landing. According to the digital system, they had been updated only weeks earlier, but the original files were unavailable for public viewing. She apologized and suggested I speak with an attorney. The drive back to the lake felt longer than usual. Gravel crunched beneath my tires as I pulled into the driveway, and for the first time since moving home, the cabin did not feel like a refuge. It felt like the center of a dispute that someone else had been planning long before I arrived. I contacted 3 different property attorneys over the next 4 days. The first declined after reviewing the paperwork, explaining that ongoing conflicts involving the Homeowners Association had become unusually complicated. The second believed litigation would cost far more than the cabin itself was worth. The third admitted something that stayed with me. He lowered his voice and said several influential developers had recently purchased large sections of shoreline around Blackwater Lake, and anyone challenging those interests should expect a long legal battle. None of them said I was wrong. None of them offered to stand beside me either. Meanwhile, the notices continued arriving with remarkable precision. Monday at 9 in the morning. Wednesday just before lunch. Friday shortly after the mail truck passed through. It almost felt automated. Each envelope carried another demand, another deadline, another carefully worded statement implying that resistance would only make things worse. One afternoon, I walked down to the marina hoping familiar faces might offer some clarity. Instead, conversations faded the moment I stepped inside. An older man named Frank, who had known my grandfather for years, quietly pulled me aside near the bait refrigerator. He glanced toward the parking lot before speaking. "Your grandfather always kept copies of everything," he whispered. "He trusted paper more than promises." Before I could ask what he meant, he simply nodded toward my truck and walked away. That sentence echoed in my mind the entire drive home. That evening, I spread every document across my dining table beneath the warm glow of the old brass lamp my grandfather used for decades. The cabin was silent except for the ticking wall clock and the soft music of the wind chime outside the porch. I compared dates, signatures, parcel numbers, survey references, and mailing records until well after midnight. The more I studied the paperwork, the less it looked like random harassment. Every notice built upon the previous one, creating the appearance of abandonment one carefully prepared document at a time. They were constructing a story on paper that completely ignored the reality outside my windows. I looked through the glass toward the docks stretching into the moonlit water, fresh cedar boards stacked neatly beside it, and suddenly realized something important. If someone had spent this much effort rewriting the present, then somewhere there had to be proof of the past that they either overlooked or believed would never be found. I barely slept that night. Every time the wind stirred the brass chime outside my porch, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying Frank's quiet advice over and over. "Your grandfather always kept copies of everything." By sunrise, the smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen, but I had already started searching every cabinet, shelf, and storage bench inside the cabin. I opened old tackle boxes filled with rusted fishing lures, dusty photo albums, faded camping permits, and notebooks covered with my grandfather's neat handwriting. Most people would have called it clutter. To him, every piece of paper had a reason to exist. Hours passed before I remembered something I had not touched since moving back. The original brass key my grandfather left with his handwritten letter. It had always seemed too large for the cabin's front door, almost decorative. I carried it into the small workshop behind the kitchen where an old cedar cabinet still stood against the wall. The cabinet had been there my entire childhood, but I had never seen it unlocked. When I slid the oversized brass key into a nearly invisible lock hidden beneath the bottom shelf, it turned smoothly as though it had been waiting years for someone to remember it existed. Inside sat a weatherproof metal box wrapped in an old canvas cloth. The hinges groaned softly as I opened it, releasing the faint smell of aged paper, cedar oil, and lake water that somehow survived all those years. Every document inside was perfectly organized. Original property surveys, shoreline measurements drawn by hand, state correspondence dating back to the 1970s, maintenance permits, environmental inspection reports, even faded photographs showing my grandfather standing beside the newly completed dock while a state survey crew marked boundary stakes that still appeared in several of the pictures. My pulse quickened as I carefully laid everything across the dining table. One folder immediately caught my attention. Across the tab, my grandfather had written in black ink, "Permanent shoreline easement." I unfolded the first page and immediately recognized an official state seal embossed into the heavy paper. The agreement confirmed that Brooks Landing had received protected shoreline status decades before the Homeowners Association had ever been incorporated. No private association could legally alter the access route, restrict the dock, or redefine the property's waterfront boundaries without direct state approval. Another folder contained certified survey maps that matched none of the updated county records I had been shown earlier that week. Parcel numbers aligned perfectly. Boundary markers matched the photographs. Every signature had been notarized years before Linda Crawford ever became a real estate agent. Then I discovered something even more unsettling. Clipped to one survey was a letter from the Department of Natural Resources warning that any attempt to obstruct public environmental access along that section of shoreline could trigger state review. My grandfather had highlighted one sentence in blue ink decades earlier. Recorded shoreline protections remain attached to the property regardless of future subdivision development. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the wind chime outside as everything finally started making sense. The Homeowners Association had not simply ignored old records. Their entire paper trail depended on those records staying hidden. Every violation notice, every revised boundary, every claim that my cabin had somehow become abandoned collapsed the moment these original documents entered the conversation. I did not celebrate. I did not call Linda. I did not even contact another attorney. Instead, I spent the rest of the afternoon scanning every page into multiple digital copies while the quiet hum of the scanner echoed through the cabin. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was no longer searching for answers. I was preserving evidence, and somewhere beyond Blackwater Lake, someone with the authority to recognize exactly what these documents meant was about to receive a very unexpected package. I mailed the complete packet the next morning using certified overnight delivery. Every original survey remained locked inside the metal box, but the copies were flawless. Property records, shoreline permits, environmental correspondence, dated photographs, notarized easements, and every violation notice the Homeowners Association had sent me over the previous weeks. I included a cover letter no longer than 2 pages. There were no emotional arguments, no accusations, and no dramatic language. I simply arranged the documents in chronological order and highlighted every contradiction between the original state records and the newly filed county paperwork. Years of engineering had taught me that facts carried more weight than frustration when they were organized correctly. Then I waited. I repaired another section of the dock, stained 2 porch railings, and replaced several cracked window frames while life around the lake continued pretending nothing unusual was happening. The brass wind chimes still greeted every afternoon breeze. The scent of fresh cedar drifted through the yard as sawdust settled across my workbench. Outwardly, everything appeared peaceful. Beneath that calm surface, however, the pressure kept building. 3 days later, another certified envelope appeared. According to the newest notice, the Homeowners Association had scheduled immediate enforcement of the community repossession order. The date listed on the document matched the same morning Linda Crawford had arrived with security vehicles and private guards. She had planned every detail well in advance. That explained why she looked so confident standing on my porch. She believed every office that mattered had already accepted her version of events. On the morning of the enforcement, I woke before sunrise. Mist floated across Blackwater Lake, softening the outlines of the pine trees along the opposite shore. The old kettle whistled on the stove while coffee filled the cabin with its familiar warmth. I folded my grandfather's handwritten letter into my jacket pocket beside the original brass key and stepped outside just as the first vehicles rolled into the driveway. The same 4 black sport utility vehicles stopped beside the cabin. Security guards stepped out carrying clipboards instead of tools. Linda followed a few seconds later, dressed with the same polished confidence she had worn from the beginning. She glanced toward the orange tape still stretched near the dock and smiled, as though the entire morning were nothing more than another scheduled board meeting. "I appreciate your cooperation," she said. "This process will move much faster if everyone remains reasonable." I answered with little more than a quiet nod. There was nothing left to argue about. Every important conversation had already happened inside sealed envelopes moving through government offices hundreds of miles away. Several neighbors gathered near the road, watching silently from a distance. Even the fishing boats offshore seemed to idle in place, as though the lake itself were waiting for something. Linda handed one of the guards a folder and instructed him to begin documenting the property. Camera shutters clicked across the porch, the dock, and the weathered Brooks Landing sign my grandfather had carved nearly 50 years earlier. Then, just as another guard reached for the chain across the dock entrance, a low rumble echoed from the gravel road beyond the trees. It was different from the quiet engines already parked in my driveway. Deeper, heavier. Every head turned at the same moment. 3 dark state vehicles emerged through the morning mist and rolled steadily toward the cabin before stopping beside the Homeowners Association convoy. Their doors opened almost in unison. Men and women wearing state identification stepped out first, followed by a silver-haired man carrying a simple leather portfolio instead of a stack of notices. Linda's confident smile remained for only a heartbeat before uncertainty quietly replaced it. The breeze lifted the brass wind chime above my porch once again, and for the first time since this began, its gentle notes sounded less like a memory and more like the unmistakable arrival of justice. The silver-haired man did not raise his voice when he reached the porch. He simply looked at the temporary chain stretched across my dock, then at the weathered Brooks Landing sign, and finally at the folder still resting in Linda Crawford's hands. The morning breeze carried the scent of cedar and fresh lake water as everyone stood waiting for someone else to speak first. One of the state investigators stepped forward and quietly introduced the group before handing the man a thin binder. He opened it without hurry, turned several pages, and compared the documents inside with the notice Linda had presented only minutes earlier. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have. Even the security guards lowered their cameras. Linda recovered first. She smiled politely and explained that the Homeowners Association was merely enforcing community regulations against abandoned property. She insisted every action had been properly documented through county records and approved procedures. The man listened without interrupting. When she finished, he closed the binder and asked one simple question. "Did your board verify the original shoreline filings before recording these updated claims?" The confidence on Linda's face hesitated for the first time. She answered that the county database reflected the current legal boundaries. One investigator immediately produced enlarged copies of the original shoreline easement, the certified survey maps, and the environmental protection records I had mailed only days earlier. The heavy paper caught the morning sunlight as each page was laid across the hood of a state vehicle. The survey photographs matched every landmark surrounding us, including the old pine tree beside the dock and the stone retaining wall my grandfather built decades earlier. Another investigator compared parcel numbers with the recently filed documents submitted through the county system. The differences were impossible to ignore. Boundary descriptions had changed. Easement references had disappeared. Several supporting exhibits cited in the newer filings did not exist inside the original state archive at all. Nobody accused anyone of anything. They simply placed one document beside another until the contradictions spoke for themselves. The silver-haired official looked toward the temporary gate blocking my driveway, then toward the orange tape wrapped across the dock entrance. "Effective immediately," he said calmly. "All enforcement activity connected to this property is suspended pending formal state review." One investigator asked the security company to remove the tape and unlock the chain because access restrictions could not continue while ownership records were under active examination. The metallic click of the padlock opening echoed across the quiet shoreline. It was the exact same sound that had greeted me at the beginning of this ordeal, yet now it carried an entirely different meaning. Neighbors watching from the road slowly stepped closer, no longer whispering among themselves. A fisherman eased his boat toward the dock and rested quietly offshore, following every word. Linda tried to explain that the board had acted in good faith, based on available information, but the investigators requested copies of meeting minutes, internal correspondence, architectural committee records, and every filing connected to Brooks Landing. Their tone remained respectful throughout, but there was no mistaking the seriousness of the request. One by one, the pieces that had surrounded my cabin for weeks became evidence instead of authority. The eviction notice disappeared into an evidence folder. The photographs taken by the security guards were cataloged. The orange survey flags were documented before being removed. Even the stack of certified letters I had carefully preserved found its place inside the investigation. As I stood beside the porch listening to the familiar brass wind chimes singing above my head, I realized my grandfather had been right all along. Paper could outlive anger, and when the right people finally read the right pages, the truth did not need to shout because every carefully preserved document was already speaking clearly enough for everyone to hear. The state review continued for several weeks after that morning, but the feeling around Blackwater Lake changed before any official letter ever arrived. The temporary gate disappeared within 2 days. The orange tape never returned. Boats once again drifted past my dock without hesitation, and neighbors who had spent weeks avoiding eye contact gradually found their way back to the porch with coffee, homemade pies, and quiet conversations. Nobody celebrated loudly because everyone understood the investigation was still underway, but the fear that had settled over the shoreline began lifting one conversation at a time. A month later, I received a certified envelope that felt very different from all the others I had collected. Instead of another demand, it contained confirmation that the enforcement actions against Brooks Landing had been suspended permanently while the state concluded its review. The letter also confirmed that the original shoreline easement remained fully valid and that no private organization could alter those protected boundaries without proper state authorization. Reading those words inside the same kitchen where I had once spread out endless violation notices felt almost unreal. The dining table that had carried stacks of accusations now held nothing more than my grandfather's survey maps, a cup of coffee, and the brass key that had quietly unlocked the truth. Several weeks after that, additional notices arrived from county offices explaining that certain recently recorded shoreline filings would be withdrawn pending further administrative proceedings. The Homeowners Association Board announced leadership changes, canceled several disputed enforcement policies, and informed residents that an independent legal review would evaluate previous property actions. I did not attend the meeting. I did not need to. My goal had never been to embarrass anyone or win an argument. I only wanted the place my grandfather built to remain exactly what it had always been, home. One cool October evening, I finished installing the final cedar board on the dock. The wood smelled clean and fresh beneath my hands, blending with the familiar scent of pine needles warming beneath the last light of the day. I walked slowly to the end of the dock, carrying the old brass wind chime that had hung beside the porch for decades. One of its cords had worn thin over the years, so I replaced it carefully before hanging it once again where the breeze could find it. A gentle gust rolled across the lake, and the soft notes drifted over the quiet water exactly as they had throughout my childhood. I slipped my grandfather's handwritten letter back into its envelope and placed the brass key inside the weatherproof metal box before locking the hidden cabinet once more. Some things deserve to be preserved, not because they are valuable in dollars, but because they remind the next generation where the truth began. As the sun settled behind the western shoreline, the lake turned the color of polished copper, just as it had on countless evenings when my grandfather sat beside me without saying much at all. Back then, I never understood why silence could feel so reassuring. Now I did. Justice does not always arrive with dramatic speeches or crowded courtrooms. Sometimes it arrives inside a carefully organized folder, carried by people willing to compare today's claims against yesterday's facts. Sometimes the oldest key in the house opens far more than a forgotten cabinet. And sometimes the quiet place a family protects for nearly 50 years survives not because someone shouted the loudest, but because someone took the time to keep every promise, every photograph, every survey, and every piece of paper that proved the truth had been there all along.